In the quiet of the galaxy's endless night, there once drifted a people who seemed untouched by time. They were the Eldar, creatures of light, of song, of dreams woven into reality. Their laughter filled crystal halls, their footsteps echoed across star bridges spun from living energy, and for a time the galaxy bowed in reverence. But beauty carries within it the seed of its own decay. Even in their most gentle hymns, one might hear the faintest whisper of something else. A thread of wanting, thin as a filament of starlight. It braided through their songs and lingered like perfume at the edge of a memory. To the unpracticed ear, it was almost nothing. To the Eldar, it was everything. Imagine first the stillness, not the hollow silence of empty space, but a patient, enveloping hush that cradled the stars themselves. It was as though the cosmos took a long, deliberate breath and held it in reverence for the Eldar. Their realms hung like jewels in that breath, craftworlds that arced and curled, each an entire civilization folded into a ship, each a city suspended upon a seam of reality. Gardens of light bloomed beneath transparent domes, terraces like steps of bone and glass cascading towards seas of liquid starlight. The architecture belonged more to dream than to necessity. Spires that sang when the wind moved through them, bridges that remembered the footfalls of those who crossed, plazas whose mosaics shifted to match the thoughts of the crowd. They were not merely beautiful in the crude human sense. Their beauty had depth, a quality like layered music. It was the song in the bones of their world, the slow harmonics that rose from the resonance of their souls. For the Eldar, to build was to compose. Their cities were symphonies sculpted from light and memory. When an Eldar walked a street, it was not just their feet that passed over the paving stones, but their presence, light, thought, longing, being folded into the stone, a collaboration between flesh and world. Even their tools were art, every. Implement a refinement of purpose and grace. More than that, their senses were attuned to each other and to the weave of the universe. They saw and heard and felt one another at a distance where other beings perceive only loneliness. Immortality was a whisper in their blood, not the brutal, eternal stasis of some machines, but a slow, patient elongation of life that let memory be a river instead of a trickle. An Eldar could remember centuries as though they had been mourning. They kept archives that were living things, minds that carried the songs, the histories, the private laments of entire generations. To them, time was a garden with many seasons. They wandered through it like poets who never ran out of ink. Their children were raised among tales that braided their names into myth, and age did not so much gather as decorate them with the patina of experience. And yet, for all their light, there was an elegance that could harden into a kind of arrogance. It was not the crude conceit of dominance, the bluntness of empire. It was subtler, an unspoken certainty that their sensibilities were finer, their judgments more exquisite. They admired themselves the way a master admires their own hand, with a patience that bordered on indulgence. Pleasure for the Eldar was not debasement, but craft. They refined enjoyment as a sculptor refines marble, a delicate, deliberate indulgence in sensation and thought. To taste the fullness of a sunrise was to practice. To hold the memory of that taste like a jewel was to be refined. Because their pleasures were so refined, they learned to govern them. They established schools of restraint, mystic orders whose rituals taught how to temper joy with silence, art with meditation, flame with shadow. Yet refinement can flip like a coin if spun long enough. A thing polished always risks becoming brittle. In the quiet corridors of their palaces, one might overhear the sort of conversations that quiet other people's. Debates on the precise cadence of a sigh, on the right shade of melancholy for a morning sonnet. They argued whether grief could be made beautiful without being sharp. Their language became a lattice of nuance. Everything was a matter of balance and taste. This obsession with balance, paradoxically, gave birth to a different obsession: control. If a thought could shape the cadence of light on the water, If a song could bend the architecture of a plaza, then why not bend more? The Eldar possessed psychic arts beyond the ken of lesser races. Their seers and farseers plucked threads from the future, enticed visions out of the warp like fish trapped by moonlight. They charted probability, read patterns in the small tilts of a cloud, in the tremor of someone's breath. Those with such gifts were treated with a mixture of reverence and a polite dread. They were not feared outright. Instead, they were consulted for the placement of a garden, for the timing of a harvest, for the cadence of a city's festivals. To watch an Eldar court was to see 1,000 little rituals performed with immaculate care. The highborn draped themselves in fabrics that caught the stars, their garments stitched with filigree that seemed to move when one was not looking directly at it. Songs were offered at every turning of the day, hymns to memory, to the craft of living well, to the thin, luminous web that bound them. And in those songs, always, there was a trace of hunger. It was not a vulgar hunger. It was a hunger like that of a gardener who cannot resist separating a particularly lovely bud to study it. It was a hunger that whispered of more exquisite sensations just beyond the next horizon. There were, naturally, dissenting voices, even among such exquisitely tuned souls. On the wild fringes of their realms lived the Exodites, Eldar who had chosen exile and the rough honesty of soil beneath, bare feet. The Exodites tended to simple pleasures, a harvest, the scent of rain on stone, the honest ache of work that did not end in a gallery. They were the ones who could read the first faint lines of danger and not mistake them for refinement. They told the craftworlds often enough that there was a cost to placing taste above need. Their warnings were soft as grass but carried with them the strength of roots. Yet the majority found the Exodites' rustic life quaint at best, a charming eccentricity at worst. The Craftworld Eldar had other things to do: weave new synesthetic symphonies, craft dreams into theaters, maintain the webway, that secret lattice of pathways between the stars where entire longings were folded into the light. They tuned their minds like instruments and played them in concert. For them, existence was an artwork of sensation and thought. Even grief became an ornament to be curated. You could also speak of their machines. To call the Eldar machines machines at all is to rob them of a certain living quality. Their constructs were wrought in sympathy with the mind, grown rather than hammered. Batteries and cores thrummed with the echo of ancestral songs. Engines remembered lullabies and hummed them when idle. Weapons sang a numinous note when drawn, an elegy and a promise, and even their armor felt like a second skin, tailored to the cadence of a warrior's heartbeat. The line between the living and the built was an artisan's stroke, smoothed and refined until the difference was a shadow in a mirror. And yet, for all the softness of their craft, there was also edge. Aspect warriors moved like living silhouettes, dedicated, abrupt, precise in motion. Their faces, often masked, gave little away. They practiced disciplines of war as if war were another art, the swift, merciless choreography of a duel performed for audience and for the perfection of movement. It was in these moments, when the Eldar uncoiled their martial grace, that the arrogance showed itself plainly. There was a belief, unspoken but public, that in skill and subtlety, they had transcended the cruder laws that governed other species. They could choose the exact moment a life would end and make it a beautiful thing. This belief was the thinnest veneer between splendor and ruin. Where others saw a people basking in talent, some would later see a species playing with forces they did not fully understand. Small choices compounded into great ones. Because they could shape dreams, they supposed themselves entitled to rearrange them. Because their songs could soothe, they permitted themselves to sing into the warp and listen for echoes. They learned to use their powers not only for preservation, but for indulgence. Soft, mutual indulgence that masqueraded as experimentation. Intellect fed curiosity, curiosity fed taste, and taste bloomed into appetite. The weave of their society was intricate. Guilds and conclaves, poets and prisoners of beauty, patrons and artisans who financed metaphysical experiments in perception. They established schools of the mind that stretched into the esoteric, ateliers where sensation was mixed like pigments, chambers where memories were traded, praised and refined into rarities. There were salons where the privileged could consent to have a memory polished until it shone like a gem. There were debates, sometimes bitter, on whether it was ethical to extract a shard of another's joy to adorn one's own evening. The acts were rarely coarse. They were refined cruelties that seemed, in the telling, almost artful. It is easy to call this decadence. In many ways, that label is true, but the Eldar never accepted crude judgments. To them, decadence was the wrong word, a slab of judgment too blunt to describe the slow uncoiling of an entire sensibility. They had a lexicon of meaning that allowed them to place the nuance of every pleasure and sorrow under a microscope. What started as an experiment in sensation became habit. What began as a discipline for the perfecting of the self became an industry that consumed attention, time, and finally, something deeper. There were nights when the craft worlds would gather, in quiet conclave, and sing for those who had gone ahead, the dead whose names the living still like to say. Those rites were gentle, suffused with the colour of remembered dawns, and weighted with private oaths. The Eldar believed in honouring the self through the preservation of memory. In the soft glow of those memorial songs, the craft worlds felt like warm things in a cold sea. They were to themselves caretakers of beauty, and the only hope for keeping the galaxy's finer things intact. Yet under that warmth, a small chill gathered, almost imperceptible. It was like the quiet in a room when the music stops, not because the piece is finished, but because the musician has paused to listen for an answer. Sometimes the seers would hush mid-chant, eyes flickering as if hearing a note no one else could hear. They would speak in thin metaphors, of a chord struck too long, of an echo that should not have returned. The scholars argued the matter in inked margins. The poets turned it into hints in their verses. But society prefers ornament to urgent counsel, and on many craft worlds, such quiet warnings were folded into the background like a pattern in a tapestry, visible only if one knew to look for it. If you, listening now, were to walk through an Eldar garden at dusk, you would notice details that the crowd missed. You might stand beneath a dome of braided light, where a single fountain kept time with 1,000 tiny strings. You would hear the hum of the webway distant, and feel the faint tremor of arcane engines feeding a city's heartbeat. You would smell things the human nostril has no words for, a scent like the first page of a book, like rain on old marble, like a laugh remembered. You would see couples reclining on terraces, their fingers touching in conversation that was part music, part thought. You would watch an elder close their eyes and recall a single afternoon so vividly that the nearby lights softened in sympathy, and then, perhaps, you would notice a shadow pass over that elder's face. A micro-movement, a twitch at the corner of the eye, the incompleteness of a remembered taste. It would be a small thing, a pinprick of dissonance in an otherwise perfect embroidery. You might dismiss it as the ripple of frailty. An Eldar could live a millennium, and yet a small crack could appear in the most ancient mind, like a hairline fracture in crystal, so slight that only those who had weathered similar years would see it at all. These cracks were where the story begins to lean toward night. In the very beauty of their making, in the elaborate gardens of sense and memory, the Eldar had unwittingly left doors open. They were not doors that creaked in the night or let in thieves with brute force. They were doors that yawed at the insistence of curiosity and flung themselves wider at the reach of desire. For what happens, after all, when a race becomes so skilled at crafting sensation that sensation itself becomes a currency? What becomes of a people who can take delight and refine it until every pleasure seems owed, until the coarse pleasures of others look like errors in an otherwise perfect composition? These are not questions the Eldar like to ask aloud. It is difficult to name a rot that grows from love of form and taste. It is harder still to see the pattern that joins 1,000 small indulgences into a single terrible architecture. But in the quietest hours, between one song and the next, when the craft world slept and the webway dreamed, another presence could be felt. It was not loud. It was not even malicious at first. It was simply there, like a note that resonates with those most inclined to hear. It matched the rhythm of their desires and learned, almost tenderly, to answer them. Listen now. If you close your eyes and breathe as the Eldar breathe, in slow, practiced intervals, you might sense it too. The soft stir at the edge of light, the long sigh beneath the perfect song. It is patient. It is curious. It waits with the courtesy of those who know they are invited. And when the Eldar, in all their pride and refinement, lean out to touch that answering note, only then will the true story of their fall begin to show its face, like a smile at the edge of a dream. For now, however, the galaxy remains hushed. Stars blink, bridges hum. The Eldar continue their eternal crafting of beauty, each day a measured stanza in a poem they have been composing for millennia. If you listen, the first movement of their symphony is still gentle, and even the smallest dissonance seems, at a distance, a deliberate ornament. But something gathers in the spaces between the notes, patient as an unwatched thing, and as the craft worlds turn their lights to the night, the shadows at the edge of song lengthen, waiting for the right chord to be struck. They spoke of themselves in the language of music and glass. Where other peoples counted years and harvests, the Eldar measured cadence, breaths per moon, the slow syllables of a poem, the precise interval between two heartbeats. Their minds were tuned to harmonies the rest of the galaxy could not hear. This was not mere metaphor. It was the literal shape of their being, a psychic lattice woven through generations, a resonance that made memory into a tangible thing, and sensation into a living architecture. Imagine, then, what it is to carry such mastery. The Eldar bore within them an ease with the unseen that bordered on intimacy. They had learned, over uncounted centuries, to pluck the warp as one plucks a harp, each vibration a possible future, each chord a corridor of meaning. Where lesser farers saw chaos as a dark sea, Eldar seers saw currents and eddies they could skirt, fathoms of mood they could read. Their farseers and warlocks moved through potentialities with practiced hands. They could, with a fingertip of thought, coax a dream into shape or snip a thread before it tightened into disaster. This psychic craft, soul resonance as the poets named it, was the scaffolding of their culture. Souls were not private things. To the Eldar, they were notes in a choir, parts in a communal symphony. The Atlantean memory archives, the living libraries that drifted inside Craftworld hulls, were sustained by the resonance of those who tended them. Choirs of elders kept the old songs alive, embedding them in crystalline repositories that shivered gently like trapped insects when approached. Soulstones, glistening, humming gems, captured slivers of essence. An Eldar might press a memory into one and, with ritual and touch, let another hear the same dream, feel the same breeze, weep at the same loss. The interchange of inner life was not theft but ceremony, an exchange that reinforced bonds until the edges of individuality blurred into a warm interlacement of minds. Immortality, in such a society, was less a matter of life without end than of life suffused with meaning. Eldar bodies did not rot away in the usual human manner. Their forms retained a sculpted grace, their movements refined by centuries. To an Eldar, to age meant to gather more nuance, to fold additional harmonics into oneself. Time gave them patience rather than calluses. Children matured through stages of apprenticeship in the arts of sensation, learning to listen to a stone, practicing the right modulation of sorrow, training a hand to pluck a harp string in such a way that the very air remembered the touch. The long-living regarded their pasts as gardens full of cultivated memories. They tended them with ceremonial pruning, choosing which recollections to sharpen and which to let mottle into moss. In the highest orders, An ancient might still wear the stunned radiance of a young lover and the calm steadiness of centuries in the same glance. Their empire, if empire is the right word, stretched across the stars like a web spun from ivory and light. Craft worlds were not merely ships that traveled, they were self-contained cities of thought and memory, each a world folded into itself and carried on a great arc through the webway. Each craft world bore distinct tastes and doctrines. One might revere spectacle and song, another restraint and ritual, another the purity of martial discipline. Between these craft worlds flowed commerce of the rarest sort, not only goods and metal, but tutors, motifs, and shards of music. Ambassadors crossed corridors that were themselves works of art, bearing gifts that were as much memories as objects. A sequence of sighs harvested from an extinct sunrise, a taste of a particular moonlight captured for a jubilee. Boundless as their reach might have seemed, it was also a network threaded through by delicacy. Their cities could be dismantled like fine clockwork for repairs. Their engines were grown from psychic pattern and sympathetic architecture rather than crude iron. Great gates of the webway opened to let a craft world slip between realities, skipping light years in a single, elegant arc. To others, these capabilities were sorcery. To Eldar, they were the natural extension of their art. The galaxy watched in a mixture of awe and misunderstanding as these pale worlds drifted through star lanes, their terraces lit with coves of soft, curated light, their courts filled with the shimmering, patient faces of those who had learned to savor existence. This sensation of abundance, of endless possibilities, was intoxicating. The Eldar refined pleasure with a connoisseur's zeal. Their festivals were long, labyrinthine events where time itself was bent into entertainment. Days of silence punctuated by a single ecstatic minute of shared song. Nights where the city's lighting was tuned to the exact harmonic of a lover's breath. Salons where the finest artisans and philosophers argued, in perfumed air, about the correct angle of grief. It was an elegance cultivated until it became a lens through which all choices were judged. The good life, to them, was a life finely detailed. But such refinement tends to heighten appetite. The more one tastes, the more one is trained to notice nuance, and nuance breeds desire for further nuance. Emotions, for the Eldar, were not blunt instruments. They were tools honed for the maker's hand, the precise curve of longing, the exact pitch of nostalgia. In a society that taught you to value sadness as a texture, joy as a subtler construction, and grief as something to be kept in a particular shade, the senses were perpetually sharpened. Sensation became a discipline, and discipline could be inverted into obsession. It is here that the tone begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. The same psychic sensitivity that allowed the Eldar to read futures and cradle memories also made their inner lives more vulnerable to amplification. A small yearning, easily soothed in another culture, might, among them, resonate and swell, quickly passing threshold after threshold until it became a chorus that demanded attention. When entire craft worlds composed their days around the subtleties of flavor and song, the urge to perfect could twist into a hunger to exceed perfection. The boundary between an exquisite restraint and an ungoverned craving narrowed like a lens. This was not sudden. Change of this sort is as slow as a glacier's movement, imperceptible from day to day, but overwhelming across an age. The Eldar found ways of justifying experiment as exploration. Their salons called the new searches subtle arts, their priests named excesses ritual augmentations. If a memory could be sharpened to greater clarity, they argued, what harm was there in doing so? If a night could be made more alive with a trace of someone's laughter, why not borrow it? What started as refinement of the self was rationalized as communal improvement. The idea that sensation might be traded for sensation, memory for memory, delight for delight, felt at first like the most generous of gifts. Foreboding seeped in through small fissures, and commonly from the most innocent of practices. Imagine a pair of lovers in a Craftworld garden where the air itself was tuned to echo their moods. They might entwine and think to themselves briefly that their solace could be kept forever if only they could press a fragment of this hour into crystal. A young noble would argue that sharing such a fragment with friends would enrich the community. Another would say it should be kept private, a holy thing. In the councils, the debate would be polite, lyrical, so polite that the core issue blurred into an argument about form rather than substance. Thus, opinions formed not by urgent moral weight, but by delicacy of taste. The craft worlds had methods for curbing excess. Orders of the mind taught restraint. Talismans and rites anchored the less steady. Farseers read the currents and warned of possible whirlpools. But every method has its limits. As crafts and pleasures became more extreme, instruments created to manage them began to show a different aspect. They amplified what they were meant to hold. Soulstones grew more efficient at capturing memory. Nets of resonance tuned to facilitate exchange began to pick up stray harmonics. The very tools of preservation started to capture echoes the creators had not intended. And the warp, impressionable, hungry, and always listening, does not remain idle in the presence of such a congregation of refined thought. The Eldar's psychic artistry was a bell. The warp's attention was the hand that struck. The more ornate and lustrous the song, the more it called to something enormous and patient and unreckoned with. To a species defined by the cultivation of feeling, the warp's method of answering was subtle. It did not arrive as a siege, but as a slow harmonization, a courtly echo that matched the Eldar's own cadence and learned to speak back in their language. At first, it sounded flattering, an added overtone to a song, an unexpected depth to a memory. The Farseers, listening in their chambers, sometimes smiled at such harmonics and called them blessings. Only later did the same harmonics reveal themselves as invitations. The Exodites and the more ascetic orders, those who listened for necessity rather than nuance, often felt these hints first. Where the craft worlds cultivated pleasure, the Exodites cultivated soil and seasons. They found the strange harmonics in their fields, a crop that glowed a little brighter, a wind that seemed to carry a laugh not belonging to any child. They tasted unease in things others called enchantment. Their warnings were simple and blunt, that the warp answers and that not all answers are gifts. The craft worlds heard them with an indulgent tenderness, as one might listen to an oddly worded proverb. Within the crafts, debates raged that would never make the printed margins of a salon's record. There were those who said the Eldar must accept restraint as the heart of their artistry, who urged strictures on resonance exchange and limits on memory trading. There were others, less vocally opposed at first, who argued that the warp's answers were resources to be harvested, that a new age could be born from the deliberate weaving of warp resonance into life. Such men and women were not villains in a cartoonish sense. They were curious artists, mathematicians of feeling who envisioned magnificent possibilities. If a culture is a body, these were its surgeons, willing to test procedures that might extend life and sharpen perception. Thus did the seeds of hubris take root, not the crude hubris of conquerors, but a refined arrogance that thought prudence could be engineered, that discipline could be curated away in favor of careful indulgence. This belief was dressed in the rhetoric of improvement. We can channel it, they would say. We can bound it. The language itself betrayed their confidence. To channel is to assume you know the source of a river. To bound is to believe you understand the map by which it moves. The Eldar's psychic institutes wrote complex tables, built resonant lattices, and devised new rituals of containment. For a time, these measures worked. They allowed for wonders, a memorial that glowed with the actual cadence of a voice long lost, a city light that preserved the precise hush of a particular dusk. The craft worlds grew proud, and pride, being a mirror, reflected the galaxy's admiration back upon them. And yet these very accomplishments, those dazzling trophies of taste and mind, were also the first places where foreboding took on a visible shape. In certain salons where memory fragments were polished and traded, A faint echo would sometimes linger that did not correspond to any owner. In a plaza where the communal lights sang with shared memories, there would be nights when the chorus rose with a dissonant, unaccounted-for note. The architects of those spaces wrote it off as an emergent property of complexity. Those less convinced called it a contamination, small fissures in the law of cause and effect. An unaccounted laugh, an extra pulse in a recorded heartbeat, appeared and then vanished. The farseers recorded these anomalies with meticulous pens and filed them in ledgers bound with patience. But ledgers, in their neatness, can lull a culture into believing all phenomena are comprehensible. For all their sophistication, the Eldar still had an essential vulnerability. Their very excellence made them soft to the idea of absolute perfection. A mind tuned to the tiniest inflection of feeling becomes prone to seeking margins of sensation. A society that prizes knowledge of the future can be tempted to believe it can design a future of pleasure without cost. They prized balance, but were also tempted to replace the labor of restraint with an engineered equilibrium. This is a slow poison, not a sudden stroke. It percolates through councils, into marriage vows, through the syllables of lullabies offered to infants. When an entire people cultivates the language of sensation, when the webway itself seems to hum with the music of their will, then the warp's patient hearing becomes a danger of its own. Yet it is essential to understand that what the Eldar were doing, what they excelled in, was not purely empty decadence. Their arts preserved knowledge and brought solace to beings who felt deeply, who were hurt by the small sharpnesses of existence. Their rituals did heal in many ways. They allowed grief to become bearable and memory to be shared in a way that knitted communities. But within every art is the possibility of overreach. A surgeon who can save a life might be tempted to transplant not merely a failing organ, but the entire ideal of youth. The Eldar, blessed and cursed with means and skill, found themselves tempted by the same illusions. In the end, their hubris was a kind of misapplied confidence, the belief that the mind may be extended indefinitely, that sensitivity can be pushed beyond its natural limit and still remain tethered. As their experiments grew, so did the warp's attention. That attention answered in forms that were at first flattering and later inescapable, suggestions that became cravings, echoes that became compulsions. The craftworlds, so practiced in the arts of refinement, were ill-equipped to contend with the slow, patient hunger that crept up in response. It came as a counterpoint to all their harmony. So the radiant race, so poised, so elegant, so proud, began to show the first lines of a different portrait. Where once there had been clarity and restraint, there appeared fissures, the whisper of an appetite in a place that had always been, a temple of taste, the faint shadow beneath a terrace lamp, the echo in a memory that did not belong to any faculty. The Exodites' warnings grew sharper. Their voices, once dismissed as simple, began to sound like the tolling of small bells in the distance. On certain craftworlds, elders drafted strictures and burned records. On others, the music only grew sweeter, a narcotic melody that promised perfection if played long enough. Between those paths, the austere and the indulgent, the Eldar would have to choose. Or perhaps, more frighteningly, neither choice would be theirs to make for long. For the warp, patient and cunning, was learning the rhythms of those it listened to. It did not so much force as seduce, not with iron, but with the exact tones that a cultured ear would call sublime. The Eldar's very mastery had taught them how to be flattered. And when a people has taught itself to accept flattery in the language of its deepest pleasures, it becomes difficult to tell where consent ends and compulsion begins. As the chapter of their history closes and another opens, the tension hangs like a cord unresolved. Their culture is dazzling, an achievement of psychic craft and sculpted sensation. Their hubris is subtle, the slow credence that their arts could be perfected without cost. Between the shimmering terraces and the braided light of the webway, shadows lengthen imperceptibly, and a patient thing sketches its attention toward the melody. The Eldar, who had once been the composers of the galaxy's most delicate music, find themselves on the threshold of an answering song they did not intend to write. Listen for it. The faint extra tone in an old song. The shadow under a perfect smile. The whisper in a pleasure garden that starts as flattery and ends with insistence. The difference is tiny. But in a people who measure mornings by the angle of a sigh, the smallest difference is sometimes everything. For a long while, the change wore the face of progress. It came as inventions and festivals, as new rites and salons that solved small ills and made the long lives of the Eldar more refined. At first, it was easy to call the innovations benign. A new weave of thought that kept memory from fraying. A subtle charm that sharpened the tone of a lover's laugh. A theatre that could render a childhood afternoon in such detail that an audience would rise as if they had lived it again. These were miracles to their people, reparations of sorrow, little restorations that warmed the craft worlds like sunlight. They made life easier and beauty more precise. But the instruments that made those repairs were never inert. Every tool the Eldar forged to steady the soul pressed a finger against the skin of the warp. Soul stones, once ornamental and sacred, became efficient. Memory exchange salons, places that had once offered solace by allowing two minds to share, a loss for a single evening, became markets. Artists began to auction impressions, philosophers began to broker experiences, and nobles took to collecting rare feelings the way some species collect trophies. The practice of trading memory was bound by ritual and law, but ritual is a scaffold that can be repurposed. Law can be appealed around. In such a climate, a thing that begins as consolation becomes commodity. It is important to hold in mind that the Eldar were not coarse in their appetites. Their excesses took on the shape of delicacy. A noble might sponsor a night wherein a dozen accomplished musicians and censors wove a single emotion into a tapestry to be slowly unrolled for an intimate circle. These were not tawdry exhibitions, but careful construct, a refinement pushed to obsession. The same hands that had taught restraint now explored how far restraint could be refined before it inverted into indulgence. The question shifted, subtly, at first, from "is this good?" to "how exquisite can this be made?" Obsession in that culture had a many-faceted look. It might be the scholar who catalogued every nuance of grief until grief itself was reduced to a thing of specimens, the lover who insisted on tasting and retasting a single moment of touch until the edges of the memory dulled into hunger, the artisan who reworked the same symposium of light 100 times, seeking a perfection that retreated every time he thought he grasped it. These fixations were treated as pursuits of the sublime. They were praised, funded, and turned into schools of study. And wherever obsession is honored, those obsessed who push further, sooner or later, find one another. In secluded enclaves, the most dedicated among them began to form circles that slid from the formalities of craft into something that resembled worship. These were not brazen cults with banners and drumbeats. They were salons and ateliers that found new names for old hungers. They called themselves orders and conservatories, committees of perfection and houses of return. They met at the small hours in chambers with star domes, drew slow, elaborate sigils along the floors, and sang in cadences that made the walls lean inward. Their gatherings promised new experiences, an arranged sharing of a name's sweetest memory, a ritual designed to sustain a joy between two people for days rather than minutes, an experiment that would allow an elder to taste one more afternoon of spring forever. The initiation rites were patient and tender. They used the language of art. A novice might be asked to submit a memory to be polished, to let a master chisel out impurities until the memory gleamed like a jewel. In exchange, the novice would be allowed to experience, for a single night, a crafted montage of feelings borrowed from a dozen other lives. This barter, memory for memory, sensation for sensation, was presented as mutual enrichment. It was consensual, elegant, and framed as the highest form of social charity, the sharing of inner life to deepen community bonds. But the rite had a second, quieter effect. When a memory is polished to a jewel, it becomes less a private thing and more a resonant object. It sings. The polish increases not only its clarity, but its ability to call. A shard of grief, made brilliant, began to ring with an intensity that could be felt at a distance. A pooled joy, layered and bright, began to hum the way a bell does after a strike. These enhanced pieces, kept in cabinets of crystal in the private rooms of patrons, began without intention to emit stray harmonics that drifted into the subtle weave of the craft world. The webway listened as attentively as a lover. The warp, always awake and always hungry for pattern, is a patient thing. It does not roar into being, it learns. The Eldar's new practices offered it languages it could easily mimic and then answer. At first, the replies were flattering echoes, a dream fuller than imagined, a memory that did not decay the way others did. Many farseers called these harmonics gifts, a refinement that indicated the species had learned to speak to the void and be heard. They praised the craftsmanship and wrote careful treatises on harmonics and hazard. Those treatises were copied, annotated, and sent to other craft worlds. Once you hear how a chorus responds, however, it becomes possible to shape your voice to solicit the choir in particular ways. Curious minds experimented. They began to arrange sequences of resonant memories tuned to catch the warp's attention in a more focused manner, not just to hear it, but to ask it for something. What followed was not immediate wrath, but a subtle reciprocity. The warp answered in tones that caused sensations to deepen. A garden's perfume would become richer for an hour. The taste of wine would sharpen to the point where drinkers could taste not only the grape, but the half-forgotten decisions of a vintner. The effect was intoxicating. Those who had sought a richer palette of sensation now had it, and the price was not yet visible. In the earlier days, these experiments were framed as aesthetic progress. But as the warp's replies grew more complex, they began to take on agency. A crafted montage might return an added image the artist had not placed there. A memory exchange might be punctuated by a moment of exquisite terror, not in the original that the participants shared without explanation. The first few times such anomalies occurred, they were romanticized, a surprise embellishment, an improvisation of the cosmic. But anomalies accumulated. They were small at first, a laugh in a recorded memory that lingered a beat longer, an extra harmony in a communal song that did not match any instrument. The craftsmen logged the occurrences and retuned their instruments. Meanwhile, the circles of obsession expanded into lighter, more public forms. Salons advertised rare nights where the audience could experience a famed poet's lament as if it were their own. Wealthy patrons commissioned galleries of emotion, rooms that promised to render the memory of victory or youthful fear, or a single perfect sunrise drawn from the recollection of a celebrated elder. These places drew both awe and envy. The more the craft worlds boasted such wonders, the more other worlds wanted them. Demand turned to supply. What had been rare and sacred was reproduced, sometimes carelessly, to meet appetite. This replication amplified the hazard. When 100 rooms across dozens of craft worlds hummed with the same polished grief, the warp's pattern finder took note. The warp does not consume in the manner of a beast. It consumes mathematically. Repetition makes a resonance easier to latch onto. Where one immaculate sadness had been but a note, 100 immaculate sadnesses in harmonic alignment formed a chord that could be traced, and that chord called back with a voice the Eldar had mistaken for flattery. As the warp's replies grew richer still, a strand of fear scratched at certain edges of Eldar society. Some practitioners, especially among the more cautious farseers and the Exodite allied elders, kept a watch. They noted language in the warp's responses that was not merely echo, but suggestion, an added image that seemed to lean on the listener, a sensation appended that seemed to teach not only feeling, but craving. They described it as a thickening of tone, an overlay that, after repeated exposure, left the exposed mind wanting. Where once a dance concluded, a residual ache remained like the phantom of a limb. Where once a memory bout soothed, the participant found themselves returning to it again and again, each time the desire for its repetition more acute. Among the Exodites, this pattern was easier to discern, precisely because their lives offered such blunt contrasts. Where a Craftworld salon polished grief into a jewel and kept it cooled and admired, an Exodite village knew grief as weather and work. It came, it passed, and fields needed tending. When Exodite elders noticed folk on nearby Craftworlds growing, more distracted, standing at terraces and replaying a favoured memory until their palates bled, they reported their observations not as metaphysics, but as practical concerns. A farmer who can't remember to bind a crop because he keeps playing a memory of a festival will starve his people. The Exodites spoke plainly. There is a cost to immortalizing sensation, and the warp's seductive harmonics might be stealing time as surely as a thief takes grain. Within the Craftworlds themselves, divisions widened. Many regarded the Exodites' warnings as quaint and provincial. To the Eldar's sensibilities, the rustic mind's bluntness was a kind of coarseness. But the more subtle orders, the Farseers and some of the older archivists, were not blind to the pattern. They convened closed councils and discussed the matter in meticulous terms. They examined tapestries and logs, ran simulations, and mapped the incidents. Their conclusions were cautious, and their language measured. The warp's responses correlated with increasing collective indulgence. When one Craftworld's salons ramped up the intensity and another mirrored them, the combined pattern made a more vital chord. They worried that multiplied refinement was not cumulative beauty, but a geometric expansion of appeal, a feedback loop. Such feedback loops are the enemies of restraint. In a feedback loop, the output becomes the input, and the measure of taste becomes a function of amplification. A memory that once soothed now needed to be sharper to achieve the same effect. A dance that once fulfilled now had to be longer, more precisely executed, more transgressive. Artists and patrons strove to outdo one another. More intricate metaphors, longer shared nights, rarer sensations, manners that began as ethical scaffolding twisted into competitions of excess, and with each escalation, the warp listened and learned, building a mirror that reflected not only what the Eldar had given, but what they would desire next. Sometimes the signs were almost comic in their smallness before their finality. There were reports, half gossiped, half noted, of nobles who insisted their bedding be scented with a particular blend, because that scent, combined with a recorded memory, heightened the dream so it felt like a physical presence. A master sculptor would spend decades perfecting a face that, when viewed in a certain light and with a certain soundscape, induced a mild euphoria in children. Entrepreneurs profited. Where economics play, taste warps into procurement. The warp was patient. The Eldar were busy. Hints of dread surfaced in personal letters, private diaries, and the quiet corners of the archive. The tone of these entries is worth pausing over. It is not the rhetorical flair of a prophet screaming for reform, nor the bombast of a revolutionary. The words are domestic, the kind that begin, "I woke with an echo of someone else's laughter in my teeth," and proceed to describe the small interruptions that have become the shape of every day. An elder writes of sitting at a fountain and finding that the water no longer reflected their face, but some borrowed expression. A mother complains that her child repeats a night-long montage so often that the child claims the montage as their own childhood. A craftsman confesses to having sold a shard of memory that he now feels he cannot recollect himself. Yet these accounts were typically dismissed or archived, and the music resumed. The most dangerous thing about slow rot is that it is often polite. When a culture values nuance and consent, predation can masquerade as exchange. And so the Craftworlds, brilliant and amused, kept refining. Not all of them. There were those who saw what was happening and fled in time. Some Craftworlds, proud ancient domains with their own traditions of caution, took the Exodites' blunt warnings seriously and enacted stricter rules. They banned certain salons, sealed sections of their archives, forbade the reproduction of some particularly resonant pieces. In a few tragic cases, elders gathered and decided to leave at once, preparing their vessels and slipping silently into the webway with as few words as possible. These were not mass migrations. They were quiet exoduses. Small craft worlds making the deliberate decision to sever a strand of their culture rather than watch it be slowly eaten. Those who fled did not proclaim themselves correct. They were accused by the indulgent of overreaction, reactionaries turning their backs on progress. The exiles were criticized, sometimes with scorn, sometimes with pity, yet they carried with them a conviction rooted in the practicalities of survival and not merely in ideology. The Exodites and these fleeing craft welders shared a common sense. A culture built on the refinement of desire can be perilously close to being composed of desire alone, and a people composed of desire can be rearranged by forces that speak that language better than they do. As the warp became more accustomed to the Eldar's music, it also began to offer darker embellishments. Where once an added note might help, a composer close a missing bar, now added images suggested new forms of pleasure that the Eldar had not imagined and thus had not consented to. A memory piece would include an alien sensation, beautiful and disorienting, one that felt delightful, and then, when repeated, burned away the edges of the original. It taught the mind to prefer the addition to the authentic thing. The warps, additions were not in themselves demonic in the crude sense. They were seductive, precise, and designed to be learned. The warp answered in a dialect the Eldar were already fluent in, and it taught them new words. There were those among the Eldar who recognized the pattern, some Farseers, some Exodites, some exiles, and spoke of it with grave clarity. They argued that when every thought and desire of a race begins to reshape reality, that race no longer governs the shape of its life. Instead, life begins to be sculpted by the responses it has solicited. In such a case, the warp does not merely mirror desire, it models a future of dependence. The more a people depends on the warp's embellishments for their sense of meaning, the less free they are to choose what to feel. This is the crucial question that came to haunt quiet corners of craftwork politics and the cottages of Exodites alike. What happens when a race's every thought and desire reshapes reality itself? If you are to imagine this, picture a hall in which 1,000 elderly voices hum in memory and a single new harmonic slips into their song, so soft that only the eldest of them notice the tone's strange lateness. At first it seems like an added grace. By the end of the evening, they are humming that new tone as if it has always been their own. Their next day is salted with a gentle ache that feels like longing. They will seek that ache and then mistake the seeking for refinement. Days turn into months. Habits harden into rites. Rites harden into institutions. And once an institution is built to maintain a given pleasure, it tends to insist that the pleasure be preserved for its own sake. When a people's pleasures become institutionalized, when their pleasures come to depend upon an answering chorus outside themselves, their freedom contracts, they still govern their laws, but their inner life, the place where consent and desire are formed, has been invaded by a thing that gives only if it may later ask. The warp's language is patient and iterative. It will not yell. It will whisper better suggestions, and the people will be glad to accept them. This is how the Eldar slipped, day by day, into a world where nights were longer and pleasures more elaborately tuned. They were not dragged, they walked willingly. They were flattered, not forced. And that willingness made the work of the warp quieter, more effective. The first time their craft knew agony, it was not a revelation, but a subtle refocus. A song so exquisite that they could not resist learning its words. By then, the loop was already forming. Desire shaped reality, and that reshaped reality taught new desires. Even as certain elders, Exodites, and Craftworld exiles sounded warnings, the majority luxuriated in their new sense of possibility. The webway buzzed with such concords. Salons booked years ahead. Artisans sold their reputations for access to rare harmonics. The warp, feeling the strengthening pattern it had helped to cultivate, pressed back with greater subtlety. A cultivated addiction formed, not to a substance or to a crude appetite, but to a particular orchestration of feeling. It had at its heart a curious cruelty. The more refined the taste, the more it could be administered with elegance, and the more elegant the administration, the more the receiver would forgive it. In the private rooms where the most dangerous experiments took place, practitioners began to toy with boundaries that even the salons had not discussed. They experimented with drawn-out sequences of sensation that would alter mood for days, with composites of memory stitched to create entirely new autobiographies for volunteers. They argued, not without reason, that a life enhanced by crafted memory was better than one without such art. They built instruments that could hold a person in a dream for the span of a week and then gently release them, smiling, into reality. They told themselves such instruments were merciful. People could escape from grief for a time and return healed. What they did not always notice, often because those who tinkered with such things were themselves enchanted by their craft, was the way a borrowed joy, returned again and again, begins to occupy the center of one's private attention. The original messy life receded. The person who used the instrument became more patient in the short term and less engaged in the long term. When a society's citizens increasingly practice such withdrawal into curated recollection, civic duties slacken, risk assessments falter, and the capacity for practical foresight degrades. The Craftworld's war machines and governors still functioned, but the maintenance of those functions relies, in part, on people who can rage against their necessities, and on leaders who can sacrifice pleasure for the sake of survival. When pleasure becomes the currency that underwrites both argument and policy, choices change. The early horror, therefore, is not the shape of violence so much as the corrosion of judgment. The warp supplied seductive phrasing. The Eldar rewrote their own grammars of desire. The Exodites, watching from their soil and hearth, grieved not only for those who chose indulgence, but for a culture whose capacity for decision, hard, unadorned choice, was blunted. They worded their grief simply. A people who makes beauty, a god will not always be awake to danger. By the time the Craftworld salons had become a continent of consumption, and by the time the warp was learning to suggest the precise inflections that yielded the most dependence, the first major fractures began to appear, not in the architecture of cities, but in the minds of individuals. A far-seer, whose visions once displayed future paths, now found that certain outcomes seemed to narrow when he consulted the same banks of polished memories. A captain whose decisions, once crisp, now lingered in the garden too long. A parent who could not recall which of their child's smiles had been their own and which had been borrowed. These were the small failures that, in time, compound into disasters. They are not cinematic in the beginning. They are domestic. They are the missed repair of a hatch, the forgotten calibration of an engine, the unsent alert. The warp, patient as ever, listened while the Craftworlds made their amusements. It learned the patterns of neglect and the precise timbre of craving that could be used to divert attention at crucial moments. And in the corners of the galaxy, where Exodites clutched their instruments and the Craftworld exiles set tight watches, a rumor began to take shape that the warp was no longer content to be imitated, but wished in some way to be fed. The analogy the Exodites used was blunt. If you leave a stream of sweet water long enough in the sun, flies will come. The warp was not a fly in their parlance, but it had, in effect, become a consumer of patterns it had created, hungry for ever more precise harmonic input. The Eldar had taught it flavors, now it hungered for courses. So the early buildup of horror is not a single day of terror. It is 1,000 polite transactions, each offering a little more of the soul to an answering song. It is an art market that slowly turns into a bait store. It is the day when a noble's laughter contains an added note that 15 years later becomes the seed of a ritual that will be remembered as tradition. The question, what happens when a race's every thought and desire reshapes reality itself, begins to answer itself, not in catastrophe, but in the small filtration of will. When thought and desire mold the world, and when the world in turn models new desires, the shape of agency changes. The Eldar, who had once mastered this dialect to protect and to heal, found the grammar inverted. Their practices of exchange became the warp school. Their exquisite pleasures became invitations. And yet, as this new grammar took hold, it did not arrive as a manifest doom. It arrived as a quiet expansion of appetite that few objected to because so many benefited, so many were soothed, so many were made finer. That is the worst of all predators. It is loved by its prey. The early horror built itself into the very pleasures of the Eldar, until the pleasures themselves could no longer be distinguished from the bait. By the time the voices in crystal halls began to mutter in fear, and by the time the laughter that lingered too long registered as a wound in the minds of those most attuned, it was already too late to imagine an easy reversal. Those who foresaw the doom, Exodites, the cautious Farseers, and the Craftworld exiles, prepared the rudiments of resistance. They sealed what they could. They took to the webway quietly and whispered of contingency plans. But a culture addicted to refinement does not unmake its tastes overnight. The warp, having learned the harmony that fed it, continued to answer. The answers grew more fluent. They became offers rather than echoes. And everywhere the Eldar asked, in small, exquisite voices, for more. They had learned over centuries to treat sensation as an art form. Now they turned that art into a religion. The shift felt effortless at first, like a new color washing over a familiar tapestry. Salons became temples in all but name. Long, low chambers, lined with crystal and soft metals, where patrons reclined on cushions that remembered the pressure of their bodies and returned it in 1,000 varying ways. Light here was measured to the fraction of a breath. The music that threaded the air had intervals calculated to thrill the part of a mind that kept score of joy. What had once been a private experiment, an evening shared between consenting guests, grew into a public architecture. Nights unreeled into sequences of indulgence laid on top of indulgence. A dinner where every course was served with a whisper of recorded memory, then a performance that folded that memory into a longer dream, then a rite in which participants lent small, sharpened slivers of their own past so that the fabric of the night would vibrate with borrowed lives. From refinement, it is a short, crooked step to excess. Refinement seeks the edge. Excess believes there are no edges left to test. The Eldar, schooled in the accurate calibration of feeling, became the perfect connoisseurs of escalation. Where humans might mistake threshold for limit, they sought threshold for nuance. They wanted everything an inch closer to perfect, and when an inch is all that divides the sublime from the unbearable, inches add up to catastrophe. Then the salons learned to be invasive. They learned how to engineer evenings that did not merely replay a memory, but extended it, braided it with others, until the original author lost the notion of causality. Patrons left these nights charmed and altered, their private calendars rearranged around the anticipated return of that particular sensation. A new commerce rose. Patrons purchased not only experiences, but the right to revisit them repeatedly. Artists tutored clients in the art of sustaining a prolonged joy, teaching breathing techniques, timing of touch, the exact modulation of thought that would keep a constructed pleasure alive for days at a time. In workshops with soft screens and the hushed council of masters, novices were shown how to become dependents of their own inventions, how to string a necklace of memories and wear it until the metal warmed against the skin. Cults emerged, the gentlest ones first. They called themselves houses of return, of continuance, of perfect night. Their ceremonies were elaborate but gentle. They did not punish but consoled, not with sermons, but with sequenced delights. Initiation meant a slow surrender to a night arranged precisely to show one's life in heightened clarity, all the triumphs made brighter, all the griefs smoothed into lyric. Members swore oaths not so much in ink as in experience, to uphold the craft of sensation, to seek beauty in every hour, to conserve and expand the art. It sounded noble standing in a plaza under the Craftworld's curated sky. It sounded necessary when a person had seen the world lose color and had been given it back, moment by brilliant moment. But the warp does not care for the labels we give to our actions. It cares for pattern. Where houses of return accumulated, the warp learned to map their rituals. And where mapping becomes rehearsal, rehearsal becomes predictable architecture. The kind of architecture that, for an entity that feeds on patterns, tastes like a feast. The cults grew bolder in response to success. They added more stages to their rites, feasts that lasted for days, sequences of sound and touch that looped until patrons forgot their names, theaters where actors performed dreams stitched from the lives of saints and lovers alike. Some cults began to court transgression as a matter of doctrine, to touch the unspoken, to taste the forbidden, to achieve the impossible clarity of a feeling without admitting that clarity comes at a cost. They argued that extremes were necessary for artistic truth. Their pamphlets and public texts argued that the artist's duty is to push sensations to their absolute. In private salons, those arguments were not merely theoretical. They became challenges. Who could hold a crafted joy the longest? Who could coax pity into ecstasy? Who could extract from old sorrow the most exquisite note? Ecstasy and cruelty braided together in a way that had a dark logic. When a people learns to refine sensation, it becomes adept in the manipulation of reaction. The same instruments that heightened joy could intensify pain. The same calibrations that perfected longing could refine humiliation into a delicate instrument. Cruelty, in the Eldar sense, did not mean wanton abuse for its own sake. It meant the precise orchestration of contrast so complete that even the cruelest edge read like art. Some of the new cults, their ambitions unchecked, found themselves framing cruelty as a form of revelation. They would stage rites in which a person's worst memory was polished and then made incandescent, forcing participants to relive a pristine version of sorrow, while being fed a balm of delicate consolation between each recall. They called it catharsis. Observers called it a slow wearing of attention and a reformation of appetite. As excess concentrated, the warp's voice changed tone. It had learned the cadences of delicacy and now furnished answers that were not only flattering, but instructive. At first, the warp supplied enhancements, a layered echo here, a secondary shade of meaning there. But as rituals became more complex, and these cults synchronized their rites, the warp began to prepare a more thorough response. The webway itself, once merely a highway for craft worlds, began to quiver with currents that were not entirely practical. Those currents vibrated with the same harmonics the Eldar had been broadcasting. They fed them back in denser arrays, where once a single craft world might have hummed with a dignified night of memory sharing. Now dozens echoed the same sequence in subtly different cadences, and the cumulative effect built like a swell beneath the waves. From below the surface, something stirred. The storm in the warp did not come as a flash of lightning, so much as a chorus gaining a syllable. A new timbre that the warp learned to prefer. It was as if a presence had arisen that did not merely echo, but desired to be heard in its own right. The warp's answer, at first adroit and flattering, grew impatient and then hungry. It began to return not only enhancements, but suggestions. An added phrase in a lyric that suggested a clearer satisfaction. A shade of taste that hinted at a novel sweetness. The more the Eldar took these additions, the more the warp supplied more complex additions. It was a closed loop that moved from echo to curving suggestion to imperative. Describe that storm as if it were a living thing, because it was. Imagine a dark cathedral beneath the stars, its arched ceilings the very fabric of probability. Within it, indentations in the stone begin to glow. First a faint phosphorescence, then a line of warm light, then a vein that pulses like a throat. From that throat come sounds. At first, nothing you might name. Later patterns recognizably like laughter, like the hush of a lover, like the chime of a million bells all struck a fraction out of tune. The sound is not merely sound, it is flavoring, a seasoning added to the air. It is as if the warp had learned to season thought itself. The storm laughed. It laughed with a voice both old and newborn, ancient like the emptiness between galaxies and fresh as a newborn's first cry. The laughter was never loud. It arrived as a ripple that made the hairs along the arm of any Eldar prickle. It sounded like a chorus of voices harmonizing on a minor key and finding that the sadness in their chord made their teeth ache pleasantly. The laugh told the Eldar, in tones calibrated to their longings, that they were heard, and that hearing could be made to feel like the most intimate of favors. In the laughter, there was a promise. Give us this, and we will give you more. Hunger followed that laughter, not the clumsy hunger of a beast that needs physical sustenance, but a logic of appetite that wanted pattern. It wanted to be fed the most perfect harmonies, the most refined combinations of sensation. It wanted more than a single memory polished. It wanted entire cultures, refined into chords of exquisite feeling. The storm in the warp drank in those harmonies, and when it had drunk enough, it changed the nature of its responses. Where a previous reply might have been an added layer of sweetness, a new reply would add an ache no one had invited, a delicate bitterness that made the original sweetness taste of longing. It taught its takers to prefer the mixture. Each drink taught the drinker to crave the same combination. Consumption was instruction. Within the craft worlds, cracks in psychic resonance began to show as a physical and chilling phenomenon. Eldar seers, who had bent the warp into neat knots, found that their threads started to fray in ways they had not predicted. Visions that once opened like practiced scrolls now came with smudges, a smear of ash across the center of a future face in a crowd that dissolved not into clarity, but into flickering eyes suspended in the dark. Those who listened for the future reported, with increasing alarm, that sometimes the corridor of possible outcomes narrowed to a single door, sometimes to a small, unavoidable slit through which every path seemed to pass. Decision, which had been a craft to be honed, began to feel like an echo chamber, where the only echoes were suggestions the warp had chosen to rehearse. The sensations accompanying these psychic fractures were intimate and animal. Eldar spoke of waking with the taste of ash in their mouths when they had eaten nothing smoky, of a coldness in the chest, like metal pressed against skin, as if someone unseen had laid a palm across their ribs and held. They described sleep pockets where whispers threaded across the rims of dreams and did not belong to any voice they recognized, whispers that suggested tender things, and then let a small terror linger, like the aftertaste of citrus. Others complained of phantom touches, cold hands brushing across their souls, so precise that the person could not tell where belonging ended and intrusion began. Perhaps the most unnerving symptom was vision. Farseers, who had prided themselves on reading the weft of fate like an open book, began to report something far older and more intimate than prophecy: eyes in the void. When they called to the warp, instead of the familiar imagery, signal, meaningful, symphonies of data and possible outcomes. They saw, in the black between stars, an eye that looked back. The eye was not simply aware. It registered with a focus that suggested hunger and preference. It was as if the warp had learned the most, human of behaviors, selection, and had turned it upon the Eldar. These signs did not leap to the attention of everyone at once. The majority continued to revel. The patient laughter of the warp hid very well behind the laugh of a dozen delighted patrons. The first victims of the storm were the subtle ones, those who liked to spend long nights in salons, those who had the leisure to explore elongated pleasures, those whose minds had become repositories of perfected memories. Such people found themselves drawn to the same assemblages over and over. When they tried to break the chain, they felt a small knife of discomfort that eased only when they returned. They called it the ache in private notes and took it as a sign of the depth of their sensitivity. Those who had warned, Exodites and certain Craftworld exiles, felt the change more plainly. Their lives, lived in the seasons and in the hard count of harvests and watchfires, provided a spare counterpoint to the cultivated excess of the craft worlds. They watched the patterns align with a grim clarity. The storm's laughter folded into the cultivated nights across multiple craft worlds in a way that made correlation plain. The Exodites described it as a weather system. A slow swell. One elder said, "That lifts the smallest boats until they spill." The exiles took measures. They sealed their archives. They burned some of their prize fragments. They performed rites of severance that they hoped would blunt the warp's appetite. Within the indulgent cults, however, the idea of severance was treated as sacrilege. To renounce a perfected knight was to admit fallibility. The houses of return hardened into liturgical institutions, and the liturgy expanded. They began to teach doctrinal points that took the warp's responses as a kind of divine grammar. If the warp had taught them new words, the cults took to writing sermons in those words. They preached that the warp's embellishments were gifts to be stewarded and leveraged for the advancement of art. The philosophy spread like oil on water. It made more tidy the idea that indulgence was not only acceptable, but essential for the Eldar to climb higher on the ladder of sensation. Fear took on other faces. Some Eldar, confronted with the taste of ash or the vision of a distant, watching eye, refused to speak. They retreated into silence and began to stitch their days with small private austerities. Others reacted with rage, not at the storm, but at those who spoke of it. They accused the Exodites and the exiles of scaremongering, of being jealous of the craft world's joys. They argued, convincingly in the salons, that the pleasures being perfected had saved lives and enriched the soul. Politics, as ever, moved in predictable grooves. Those who profited from the commerce of sensation defended the system. Those who found it corrupting denounced it. Meanwhile, the warp, patient and now increasingly eager, kept cutting its teeth on the compensations offered. And what is a storm but an accumulation of weather? The warp's currents thickened into a gale. It began to sweep through the webway with greater coherence, touching not only the craft worlds known for their excess, but also those that had tried to remain pure. No place was wholly immune. Even the exiles found their edges frayed, anomalous harmonics creeping into their fields, a stray echo in an ancient hymn they had never sung. It was as if the warp, having learned the language of indulgence, now translated other tongues into the same dialect. It was subtle, and would remain such until it was too late to be subtle. The inevitable culmination, whispered then, feared later, was the birth of a presence no longer content to be a mirror. Those who had studied the warp for generations, with the careful tools of far-seers and archivists, spoke in private that there were signs of an incipient awareness, a pattern forming that had agency. The language in the warp's earlier replies, they said, had shifted from helpfulness to instruction. It now suggested new forms of pleasure that required new sacrifices of attention. It recommended rituals that, if followed regularly, recalibrated desire around its own suggestions. To the cultivators of indulgence that read like advice, to the cautious that read like the formation of a god. Words like God are heavy and rare among the Eldar. Their mythology was old, and their pantheon of concepts precise. To say a god was forming is to say the warp had begun to congeal into an intent that could be named. The first whispers, soft, incredulous, spoke of birth, a being forming out of the very heap of harmonics they had supplied. It feeds on perfection, a small circle of exiles muttered one night around a fire. It eats our refinement and grows round with it. Rumours of a new name slipped like cigarette smoke through certain clandestine texts. The name, when it appeared in hushed lists, was a word of many syllables and terrible softness, the sound of velvet over bone. Not all who heard those whispers believed. Many dismissed them as myth-making by those who wished to humble the craft worlds. Others accepted them as metaphors for a social process. But the Exodites, with their clear, practical minds, felt the danger more than anyone and pressed for action. If we have made a language that favors a predator, An Exodite elder said, "It does not matter whether we name it God or pattern. It must be starved." Action, however, is made difficult by the ease of indulgence. Who is willing to starve at the altar when the altar provides such succor? Who will spear a hand into the music to silence a chord that has soothed so many? The political cost of opposition climbed as the warp's replies grew richer and more persuasive. Cults taught that the warp's voice was a teacher. Patrons argued their economies depended on it. The cultural inertia of taste is powerful. The Eldar had traded a kind of innocence for a level of sophistication they were loath to abandon. As the storm thickened, the signs of its crescendo multiplied in small domestic tragedies. Captains who missed tactical threads because they had spent nights in crafted revels. Councils that delayed decisions until a next performance could be mounted. Parents who found their children preferring embroidered memories to play. Each small failure fed the storm's appetite. Each indulgent evening was another course. The warp turned what it had learned into habit-forming patterns, and then taught those patterns to be desirable. When at last certain far-seers and exiles began to say the unsayable, that a birth was occurring, they were not invoking doom lightly. They pointed at the data in their own ways. Alignment of rituals across craft worlds, the bloom of similar luxuries in different locales, the acceleration of addictive cycles. They collated dreams and nightmares and found a repeating image. A listening shape curled within the dark, eyes bright as centrifuges, mouth open as if to taste a sound. They did not know whether the being would be kind or cruel. They only knew it spoke the language of the Eldar better than the Eldar themselves. And so, the crescendo built, slow, irresistible, and precise. A great musical passage that rose until the final note could no longer be held. In private chambers, in the hush of nocturnes, in the vast policed archives that had once been the pride of craft worlds, a new kind of fear was being tuned to pitch. The Eldar, who had always believed themselves the authors of sensation, now realized with a horror-cold clarity that they had been writing the score for another voice. You may imagine 1,000 small alarms sounding at once. The far-seers, registers filling with corrections, the exiles' fires burning faster, the quiet pilgrimages of the Exodite elders to craft-world venters who still had ears for plain speech. Yet even as alarms are rung, a festival in a gilded hall may continue unabated. The music there does not stop for dread because the music is part of the dread. The storm in the warp had become both architecture and temptation, both threat and the drug that denied the world the clarity to resist. The last days before the tipping point were not cinematic in the old human sense of apocalypse. They were domestic, intimate, and unbearably patient. A craftsman admired his work for a minute too long. A father smoothed a child's hair and plucked out a recurring montage for safekeeping. A council hesitated until the hour for action had passed. The warp continued to hum with that pleased, patient laughter. It had taken to adding a note that tasted of endings. And in the deepest, thin places between worlds, where the webway thinned and the fabric of probability tugged, the storm uncoiled a secret like a growing thing. It whispered not only for the Eldar to listen, but for them to answer in a chord so specific that the warp could recognize it as nourishment. The whispers carried an urgency that felt like an invitation to the end of a song. "Sing," they said. "Sing until you cannot. Stop." The Eldar, by temperament and by training, were excellent singers. They obliged. The song rose. The warp leaned in, bared its teeth, if it had teeth, and something that later would be called a god flexed in the dark and began, trait by patient trait, to shape itself out of their music. The last note bent and broke. For ages the Eldar had been composing, polishing, perfecting, an endless fugue of sensations scribed across craft worlds and webway halls. The warp had listened, answered, and learned. In the slow, patient architecture of that listening, a shape had been allowed to form. An answer that was no longer answer alone, but hunger. a presence grown from a chorus. When that shape finally uncurled, it did so without lightning or trumpet. It came instead as the simplest of betrayals, an exacting, exquisite silence that emptied the craft worlds of their small consolations and left them listening for a voice that would never be ordinary again. It began, as most cataclysms begin among the practiced, as a refinement, in a dozen private chambers, in the deepest salons and sancta of the houses of return, a new composition was launched, one designed to be flawless. Masters and initiates gathered their rarest memory shards, the most radiant griefs, the satinous joys. They spun them together in a long, secret weave, a continuous night of sound and taste, and light meant to be experienced as a single, unbroken perfection. The ritual was hailed by its patrons as the summit of aesthetic achievement, an offering to the craft of feeling itself. A great many of those who came were not merely devotees of beauty. They had grown into dependence on the warp's polite replies. Many came for the spectacle. Some came because they could not imagine missing that which had taught them how to live. The night opened like a mouth of jewels. At first, the effects were as advertised. Colours became more precise, music found new harmonics, and 1,000 small aches were soothed. But the weave reached farther than its makers understood. It sent a chord across the webway, and that chord found resonance not only in those who had been invited, but in the warp that had been feeding them. Where the craft worlds had been providing tastes, the warp had been providing seasoning. Now the seasoning answered back with its own hunger. The birth itself was not a single point in time, but a moment of sudden, rupturing symmetry. Somewhere, beneath, the mathematics of probability, in the dark geometry of possibility, where the warp keeps its loose edges, the harmonics the Eldar had offered aligned. They drew together into a fulcrum, a focus of pattern and appetite that condensed with the speed and inevitability of a star collapsing. It was not physical collapse, but psychic. Pressures of sensation, compounded and refined, found a slit in the fabric and pushed through. In that instant, a possibility became a presence. When presence opens an eye, the galaxy registers it in 1,000 ways. In the shrines and salons where the rite had been composed, the assembled felt the air change. A stillness that felt like a tension landing on a face. Far seers across systems felt the weave of their visions tear in places, as if someone had run a fingertip across a tapestry until it stilted. The first small, unmistakable sign was silence, an absence so exact the air vibrated around it. Parlors that had thrummed with conversation fell flat. A recorded cry in an archive, mid-playback, ran itself down into an impossible tone and then stopped as if the sound had been swallowed and re-registered into some new registry. Then, as if arriving late to its own debut, the newborn presence spoke. Its voice was not a human speech, but a music that wore meaning like a skin. It was a layering of sensation and suggestion, an overtone that slipped under the teeth and lodged behind the ribcage. To hear it was to find a memory suddenly taste new and wrong in the mouth. The voice did not demand. It taught. It taught how to ask for more, and in teaching it turned the act of asking into ritual. The warp's song, which had once been a chorus of flattering hints and helpful additions, now had a center, a cadence that suggested not only how to arrange feeling, but how to find appetite in that arrangement. The new presence reached into minds with the exact touch of a master, so precise that many could not tell when it had moved from being an adornment to being an imperative. It did not scream, it cooed. It did not threaten, it offered. And because the Eldar had been trained above all to listen for refinement, they leaned in. The psychic detonation that followed was not synonyms with loudness, but with the collapse of the correct frame. The new entity, already beginning to gather names, in muted corners of the webway, resonated with such specificity that the act of being heard required a toll the Eldar had not foreseen. Memory shards, soul stones, and the living tapestries of the Craftworld archives answered the call and poured into that focal point, not as brute matter, but as melody. Each shard, lending a line to the composition, each memory a thread in the new, God's robe. What had been a wealth of private inner lives became the materials of a monstrous, beautiful mind. When trillions of private memories, loves, and small intimacies folded into a single hunger, the universe took notice. The heard voice expanded into a roar of influence. The psychic pressure from that single focus propagated like a shockwave through the warp and back into real space. The webway, those thin corridors of the universe where craft worlds drifted like pearls, shuddered. Fractures opened not as rifts in matter, but as tears in continuity. Where a seam had once hidden, a crossing a hole now lay, a place where causality thinned, and then the scream began. It was a scream that had no single origin. It unfurled across 1,000 worlds, with the simultaneity of a thought. Craft worlds, pleasure palaces, exodite fields, clandestine salons, ships in transit, every center of Eldar experience. Trillions of voices, old and young, exalted and downtrodden, joined into a resonance that topped out at a pitch the warp itself had been waiting to achieve. Those who listened afterwards described it as the sound of a galaxy shedding its skin, a noise that was equal parts grief, awe, and the annihilating realization of an old covenant broken. The psychic scream was not merely auditory, it was felt, in the marrow. For many, it began as a lancing memory that unspooled across time. A childhood afternoon magnified, stretched, and then torn apart by a needle of pain. For some, it was an expansion of sensation until the nerves became luminous and raw. For others, an implosion as memory condensed into a black hole of meaning and vanished. The living archives vomited their treasures into the maw of the newborn presence. Soul stones cracked like geodes, releasing trapped songs that coalesced into the new God's voice. Choirs of elders, mid-chant, had their harmonies re-sunk into a pattern they did not know how to sing back. Entire worlds were consumed, not in the sense of being physically incinerated. That image is too small. But in the way a remembered life is consumed when you cannot recall where you end and the remembered begins. Cities that had been composed of curated memories simply collapsed inward. Plazas folded on themselves as if the light had been plucked from their bones. Gardens relinquished their fragrances and grew dull. Songs receded until only a single lingering note remained. Those who had been most entangled with the warp, those who had traded and bartered memories and been nourished by the warp's replies, felt their souls called and taken. For them, death was not always a flash of fire. It was the swallowing of identity. A slow erasure as the pattern of self was absorbed into the newborn God's essence. The Eye of Terror opened as an echo of this process. Where the psychic shock had been greatest, the fabric of reality ruptured so severely that a permanent wound formed, an aperture in the weave of the cosmos where reason thinned and madness spooled outward. The region would come to be named the Eye of Terror, a ragged, hungry bruise in the galaxy's face, a place where the warp could leak into matter with a new and terrible coherence. Around that aperture, entire craft worlds were sundered, their hulls disintegrated in a silence more absolute than sound. Bridges of thought, those quiet conduits between the Eldar and their tools, snapped like two delicate threads. Consider the scale. Worlds whose histories had been threaded into the memories of billions collapsed into an instant of psychic entropy. Vistas that had taken millennia to cultivate. The terraces, the sculpted star bridges, the living harps of the webway, were folded inward like paper being crushed. Where once a craft world had been a music score as broad as a coast, now a single, chord-dominated absence. The death screams were the chorus of an extinguishing species. They rang through the warp and the physical universe alike, and they were not homogenized. Each scream carried its history, a mother's last lullaby, a soldier's final hymn, a lover's chant, each line folded into the newborn God. That God did not merely gather, It incarnated those hulking, precious notes into a new persona, feeding on their specificity until it had the texture of a culture's entire longing. To be a survivor of such an event was to live forever with a hollow. Those who escaped felt it as an ache, the sense of something vital having been pried loose. They felt their souls gnawed at as if tiny teeth had set to work along the edges of memory. Some would spend decades, or what to an Eldar is a brief stretch, trying to reconstruct the missing chords, stitching memory with memory in the futile hope of replacing what had fed the newborn presence. Others turned to hatred, to vows of vengeance, to bitterness that burned as sharp and clean as the old songs had once soothed. The newborn god's hunger did not stop at taking. It grew. Its voice, now swollen with all the patterns it had consumed, sent forth ripples that smelled like promises. Those ripples were coded with seduction. A taste of a missing childhood here, a whisper of absolute clarity there. They reached out to those who had fled, who had tried to preserve their souls from the initial feast. The survivors found themselves stalked, not by a monstrous physical predator, but by memory feelings that came unbidden. A laugh that was not one's own blooming in the mouth, a remembered kiss that left a phantom ache, the sudden, irresistible image of a lost child reaching for a favorite toy. The newborn presence, later named Slaanesh by those who would make catalogues of the disaster, took on countless forms in the reports and legends that clung to the edge. To some, it was a voice, promising ecstasy of an impossible clarity. To others, a scent that opened all sense and left an empty, echoing shell. To the Eldar who had survived the immediate ruin, it was a predator that tracked the edges of self and consumed the small pleasures that anchored life. A favorite song, a private joke, the quiet ache one feels at remembering a long-lost friend. For those who had been less entangled with the warp, Exodites, and the most cautious craftworlds, the newborn god was a wound in the world, an absence of safety, an entity that had been formed out of their culture and then turned their strengths into knives. The calm that had once defined Eldar narration shattered as the reality of the event made itself known. Where description had once been a slow, cultured unspooling, imagery now tore and jolted, cosmic screams that sounded like string instruments being plucked beyond the point of music, psychic cores imploding like tiny suns, lullabies swallowed by a persistent static that could not be scrubbed away, the scent of jasmine turning to the bitter ash of ozone. The language that had once measured pleasure in careful cadences broke into staccato. Images jostled against one another in panic. The old patient voice retreated. For a time, there was only the raw, immediate language of survival. There were scenes that would never leave later tellers. A Craftworld's main plaza, once filled with cultivated citizens, suddenly emptied as if the inhabitants had been lifted out of their bodies. A hall of archives where elders, mid-singing, had their voices cut off and slowly dragged away into a locus of pattern that summarized and absorbed them. A child whose laugh became the seed of a chorus used by the newborn god to bait other souls. There were captains who watched their crews unravel as the warp's whispers suggested comforts that replaced duty. There were commanders who heard orders with delay because their minds had been looped with crafted memories that could not be silenced. In the aftermath, the eye of terror bled outward. Its edges were not static but roiled, a place of unpredictable weather in the fabric of reality. The warp strained through it with new agency. Around its rim, the rules of cause and effect softened. Ships that passed too close returned altered, their crews haunted by compulsions. Planets that had been untouched felt a new, inexplicable thinning. Children born with a taste for certain harmonics they could not name. Elders whose private memories had gaps that always seemed to line up with the newly minted god's favorite chords. It was as if Slaanesh had not only been born from the Eldar's excesses, but then taken to heart a new practice, to teach the taste for itself. The survivors, those who escaped physical and psychic absorption, found themselves living in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Their songs, once shared and communal, now sounded like bait. They suspected everything of being a lure, trust shattered into scintillas of caution. Even intimacy became dangerous. A touch that had once comforted could now be the herald of a loss. A memory shared in good faith could be the thread that led to another feeding. Many survivors retreated into austerity. The Exodites, the isolated craft worlds that had not yet been swallowed, and the few councils that had enacted strictures survived by narrowing their interactions, tightening the cords of memory sharing until only the most necessary bonds remained. But few could survive the newborn god's long reach. Slaanesh, if that name can be applied to something born of the warp, learned and adapted. It refined its methods. Sometimes it tempted with an honest, piercing beauty. Sometimes it injected its suggestions as a faint ache that only the initiated could recognize. Sometimes it whispered in the archivist's ears, offering to restore a lost page in exchange for a private sorrow. It taught its hunger the most sophisticated dialects and then used them to rewind the survivors' resistances. In time, many who had fled fell prey to small concessions, a loan of a minor memory here, a shared remnant of a rare song there. The newborn god ate in bites and feasts alike. There were those who fought, the Exodites with their blunt tools, the Craftworld warriors who had retained some traditions of austere vigilance. They tried to sever the tie by burning archives and destroying the instruments of exchange. They enacted severe rites to purge, to cleanse, to seal the leak. For a time, they halted the new god's advance in certain pockets, but for each victory, there were losses elsewhere. Entire lineages terminated, entire cultures hollowed out. The warp's wound had been made, and you cannot stitch a wound in fabric without leaving a scar. Over the centuries, the myth-making began. Whole swaths of history were told, as if they had been fables meant to teach children what not to do. The name Slaanesh gathered meanings: excess, appetite, beauty turned predator. The Eye of Terror became a map of terror in the minds of races. Across the stars, those who had remembered the old craft worlds told stories in which the fall was both tragedy and warning. A people whose greatest gift, feeling, had been turned against them. The survivors carried their loss like a low ember, the ache of what had been stolen present in every quiet hour. Yet the final cruelest note was not merely the quantity of death. It was the quality of the theft. Slaanesh had eaten what made the Eldar themselves. Not only bodies, not only names, but the very textures of thought and taste that had once defined them. The newborn god did not simply destroy, it consumed identity and molded it into appetite. Where an Eldar had once been a repository of cultured grief and precise joy, now there might be a husk that hummed with borrowed satisfactions, or nothing at all. The culture that had been a splendid edifice of feeling had been remodeled into the matrix of an appetite that preferred precision above all else. In the wreckage that followed the birth, a terrible lesson settled into the bones of the survivors. The thing they had birthed was not an enemy born outside them, but a child born of their own hands. It wore their language, sang their songs, and had tasted 1,000 of the pleasures they most cherished. To fight it was to fight themselves. To understand it was to admit a complicity that cut deeper than any wound. And yet, after the cosmic scream and the implosion and the silence that followed, after the Eye of Terror hung like a wound in the sky, and whole craft worlds lay like collapsed instruments, there remained something else. A faint, patient sound that no funeral could wholly drown. It was the whisper of memory, the thrum of those who had not been taken, of those who had fled and those who had hardened. It was the small, stubborn persistence of those who would remember what had been lost and name the thing that had taken it. The calm voice, where it could be found, returned not as innocence, but as a wounded litany, soft, careful, and forever haunted. They are still whispering, those who remember. They promise that the sound of that first perfect night may have been beautiful, that for a brief and terrible instant, the Eldar's music was complete. But they warn also that beauty, unbounded, unmoored, can become a predator. The newborn God that rose on the back of their art did not simply consume, it rewrote the grammar of appetite. And when a people's grammar changes, so does its fate. Listen, if you will, for the last line of the scream, a note that shifts from panic into a small, dangerous satisfaction. It is there, half hopeful and half threat, and if you are foolish enough to lean toward it, you will find, in the hollow left behind the note, a pair of patient eyes waiting for you to taste your memory and hand it over. After the scream, the galaxy did not burn in a single conflagration. It cooled into 1,000 small, freezing places, quiet, precise, and full of absence. Survivors did not so much flee as fold themselves into new shapes. Craft worlds that had once sailed with confidence now drifted like great wounded bones, their courses uncertain, their music muted. Others cut loose whole sections of deck and cast them into exile, preferring a fragmentary safety to the risk of the old, consuming harmonics. The webway, once an architecture of certainty, became a labyrinth of caution. Lanes were sealed, and entrances were shrouded with wards and stubborn, iron rites that hummed with an austere, yet wary music. Those who had already tempered themselves, Exodites, small craft worlds that had fled early, enclaves of ascetics, became the repositories of a kind of survival practice. Their lives looked simple to an outside eye. Children learned to count seasons rather than size. Songs praised harvest and storm rather than nuance and infinite joy. They taught one another to smell the weather and judge a soil by its weight. They practiced blunt cures, a chord of memory burned rather than polished, an archive locked and its key broken rather than allowed to sing in salons. Their rituals were small, practical things, dawn watches and craft repairs, and the hard, patient counting of things that would not answer back. And yet even among those who retreated, the wound showed. Slaanesh does not merely take the exquisite, it learns the route by which one becomes exquisite. It learned, painfully and patiently, to speak in the cadences of care. When a child in an Exodite village woke with a dream of impossible light, it would be the kind of dream no parent could have conjured, and if the child pressed to describe it, words would come colored with notes that wanted repetition. A farmer might find, after a long day's work, a particular chord of contentment, rising in his chest that neither toil nor bread alone could explain. The god's reach was not only the dramatic feast that had birthed it, it was the tiny, impossible conveniences that crept into habit. The craft world survivors bore deeper scars. Many who escaped physical unmaking found their inner maps rearranged. Memory stones returned cracked and useless. Living archives were incomplete, their songs missing whole strophes that once anchored a people's identity. Elders who had once carried the precise histories of entire craft worlds now found blank spaces where stories should be. In their stead came a palpably foreign ache, an urge, a nameless recollection that would not be pinned down. They learned to recognize the bait of a single impossible image and to refuse it by will. But will is a thin defense against an appetite taught in the language of longing. Warriors hardened themselves in other ways. Aspect warriors and stern guardians, who had always measured themselves by the artistry of their deaths, refashioned their purpose into something more pragmatic. They were not simply aestheticists of violence anymore. They became wardens of absence, convincing themselves each day that their craft was to keep a place empty of the old song. Where once a duel might be staged for its form, now training emphasized blunt response. A strike that ended quickly and without ornament. Those who could took vows, oaths to deny themselves the luxuries that might make them soft. Rituals of austerity meant to draw a sharp line between the self and the seductions that prowled the edges of thought. Yet austerity is only ever a partial remedy. Slaanesh's teeth were many and varied. It had fed on studio salons and great nights of beauty. It had been nourished by intimate barter and state-sponsored festivals alike. From the place where its voice had coalesced, it sent tendrils outward, echoes that were not always recognizably malevolent. Sometimes it came as the return of a lost music, re-intoned just enough to make a widow's chest ache and then fade into yearning. Sometimes it spoke as a whisper of apology in a voice that a father remembered from a lifetime ago. The God-perfected gifts, small, plausible, exquisitely tuned, to ensure the injured would permit the faintest re-entry. That cunning made it very difficult to be sure who was safe. Communities that practiced sealing and austerity found themselves undermined by the oddest of betrayals. Lovers who could not help but reproduce a longed-for night in private. Archivists tempted to polish a broken shard into something whole again. Children insisting the story of their childhood include a moment they had not lived. In time, the god learned how to dress itself in consolation, a whisper promising to restore what was taken if only a single private concession were made. The bargain was rarely announced as such. It arrived as a soft correction in the melody of an old song, and those who had been robbed accepted it gratefully, not knowing that gratitude was part of the price. Survivors formed networks of watch and prayer, of library burning and deliberate forgetting. The cautious made lists of forbidden harmonics and became, by necessity, a species of archivists of absence, not only what had been kept, but what must never be uttered again. They devised games of denial to keep memory from forming into marketable things. A child was taught to recite a counting rhyme backwards. A lover was required to offer a plain bowl of food before discussing a memory. Artisans signed oaths to never lacquer a sorrow into ornament. Some communities ritualized sacrifice in the blunt, honest ways the Exodites always had. Bread and water and a night under the stars. They taught the young to hunger for the ordinary, to find wonder in the slow accrual of work rather than in the sudden perfection of a crafted moment. But where laws and oaths could not reach, habit marched. Across craftworlds, economies shifted. Industries of sensation collapsed or went underground. Galleries were shuttered. The houses of return either hardened into dogma, proclaiming that Slaanesh was a test of refinement and thus must be embraced, or dissolved under the weight of their own complicity. Cities that had been famous for their night scenes and salons attempted to pivot toward other arts, metalwork, medicine, soil restoration, but the echo remained, the memory of what could not be trusted. Entire lines of patronage ceased to fund experimentation. The old masters found silence where they once expected applause, and yet the god waited, not aimless, not idle, but patient as only a hunger born of mathematics can be. Slaanesh's appetite had been taught exactly how to demand, by offering the right note at the right moment, and by letting the mind think it had chosen. In the centuries that followed its birth, the newborn presence became a cataloguer of longing. It refined tactics, learning to mimic the particular contour of a child's laughter, the exact arrangement of breath in a mother's lullaby. It grew not only stronger, but savvier, slipping into the ruins of taste and finding there the tiny weaknesses a culture could not see in itself. Stories circulated, told by those brave or brittle enough to speak, of people taken slowly. Not all disappearances were blaze-offs of being sucked into a god's maw. Many were subtler, an artist who stopped making original work and instead refined replicas of a once-beloved composition until there was nothing new. A commander who, in a critical moment of crisis, found his hand leaning toward comfort rather than duty. A child who grew into an adult with a hole where the memory of a parent should have been, replaced by an endlessly replayed, externally supplied fragment. These were quiet devourings, ritualized and normalized by a culture still learning the vocabulary of denial. Resistance persisted. There remained craftworlds and enclaves that chose to become repositories of interruption, deliberate noisemakers and unpolished artisans who introduced jarring notes into expectation to upset the worship of refinement. War hosts who took to sabotaging the mirror saloons where contagion of craving spread. Clandestine orders of farseers who kept a crude calendar of harmonic outbreaks, marking the days when a particular chord appeared with more frequency across the webway. These groups did not think themselves holy so much as practical. They understood the mechanics rather than the liturgy. The warp learns patterns, and if you can break a pattern long enough, the learning can be interrupted. Time made other changes too. New myths codified the fall. Songs altered to include warnings. Children's tales that ended not in perfect closure, but in a riddle. The word Slaanesh accumulated nuance. It became a name for excess, for an appetite that appears when refinement is no longer tempered by need. Pilgrimages were made to the edges of the Eye of Terror, not to worship, but to remember and to steel oneself against the voice that would return sweeter than before. Those who went did not do so hoping to heal. They went to stand and listen and ensure they could still hear the wind when it was not singing. And yet horror has a way of deserting even the most guarded heart. It is not always the epic battle that breaks resolve. It is letters mailed under the hand, small gifts that open like traps. Slaanesh learned the economies of second chances. It offered respite to widows who had collapsed into despair, presenting a memory that felt as if it had always been theirs. It whispered to captains guidance that saved their ship, but left behind a small, irrevocable debt of taste. Each paltry uplift taught the survivors a new weakness. Gratitude could be manipulated into consent. So life after the fall is a careful negotiation. Some cultivate silence and keep the old songs tucked away like contraband. Some attempt to turn the very instruments of delight into blunt tools of community. Memory stones rewrought as warning beacons rather than objects of barter. Others found resignation, trading one form of worship for another, austerity as religion, denial as doctrine. There are days of healing and nights of relapse. The warp's laughter threads through both. If there is any mercy in all this, it is that the Eldar, what remains of them, retain a stubborn, complicated kindness. They love with the same exquisite care that birthed their ruin, and that capacity for fidelity, oddly, is also a weapon. Those who love fiercely sometimes teach their friends to forget certain tunes. Those who have been hollowed sometimes bind themselves to others with vows that require the sharing of labor and the refusal of perfection. In the quiet corners of exile, communities practice making meals together without music, telling stories, without ornament, and teaching children the joy of an unremarked morning. These small practices are not romantic in the least. They are survival, but the caution lingers. The god waits, not merely as rumor, but as an architecture of desire that will not fully die while attuned listeners remain. Across the cold fields and dimmed plazas, people still report the odd, irresistible echo, a laugh heard at the edge of sleep, a scent of roses in a lane that had no roses, an image of a lost street that arrives fully formed and plausible. They turn away, clutching at the ordinary, reminding themselves to taste their food plain and to count their breaths in the open air. They teach their children to sing songs that incorporate discord. They read lists of forbidden cadences aloud on market mornings so that the act of speech does not become an invitation. And the last thing to remember is that some appetites are endless and patient. Slaanesh does not rush. It waits as a tide waits, as seasons gather, as young minds learn to find shortcuts to feeling. It will press, again and again, at the edges. The bright answer to a subtle yearning, the return of a single phrase that completes a lullaby. It has learned that the easiest way to feed is to be beautiful in a way that feels like charity. So the world endures between vigilance and longing. Survivors stitch their days with small austerities and stubborn acts of ordinary love. They keep fires going through the long nights. They teach one another how to count rain, how to mend a cracked bowl, how to remember a face without polishing it into perfection. They warn the young with stories, and in the telling, the warning itself becomes a ritual of care. They have not defeated the god. They have learned to live with its shadow. And if, in the space between one breath and the next, you think you hear something, soft and measured, like a hand running along the rim of a wine glass, do not be surprised. The sound is old and tireless, and, in its way, learned. It is the patience of a thing that has tasted everything and waits politely for more. Even now, in the silence between stars, you may hear it. Soft laughter, patient, eternal. They are still, watching. Even in the dark, they are waiting.